They said the house was empty, that the windows only looked like they were watching, that the silence inside was just old wood settling and nothing more. But the truth is, some homes are not abandoned, they are preserved, like evidence. And there's a road in rural Pennsylvania that doesn't appear on most maps anymore. It curves through dense trees that swallow sunlight by mid-afternoon, and if you follow it long enough, you'll reach what's left of the Colt property. A collapsed fence, a mailbox without numbers, and beyond that, a house that still stands when it shouldn't. This isn't a ghost story. It's worse than that, because ghosts can be dismissed. Records cannot, names cannot, dates cannot. And what happened inside this home didn't vanish. It was buried, carefully, intentionally, like so many other things in American history that were too inconvenient to survive daylight, and the Colt family wasn't famous. That's why their story survived as long as it did. No headlines, no documentaries, no viral headlines to expose what lived behind those walls. Just fragments, census records that don't line up, school reports with entire years missing, police logs where incidents are referenced but never described. A town where older residents grow visibly tense when the name is spoken. It begins, as these stories often do, with respectability. Church on Sundays, well-kept lawn, polite children, the kind of family people trusted without question, the kind of family no one thought to question at all. But when you start pulling threads from old records, patterns begin to emerge. The Colt children changed schools frequently. Teachers noted withdrawal and unusual silence. One counselor wrote that the youngest, Daniel Colt, showed signs of persistent fear but never elaborated. Another wrote that the oldest, Margaret, seemed older than her age and guarded beyond necessity. These aren't dramatic accusations, they're worse. They're the kinds of notes that suggest something is wrong, but not enough for anyone to intervene, not enough for anyone to dig deeper, not enough for anyone to save them. And the town played its role too. Small towns always do. People noticed things, but they noticed quietly. A neighbor recalled hearing arguments that didn't sound like arguments, but couldn't explain what that meant. Another said the children were never allowed friends. A retired mail carrier once mentioned that the Colt house had more outgoing mail than incoming, and that every letter was thick, heavy, like journals. He said he didn't open them. He didn't need to. He just remembered the weight. That detail matters more than it should, and because those letters never arrived anywhere. And by 2004, the family stopped appearing in public altogether. No church, no grocery store sightings, no school attendance. The official explanation was relocation, a job opportunity out of state, a fresh start. But no forwarding address was filed. Utilities continued to be paid for 6 months after they supposedly left. And then suddenly nothing. Power cut, water shut off, phone disconnected, the house sealed in silence. And years later, a county archivist named Elena Ramirez began digitizing old property records. That's where this story truly begins. She wasn't looking for anything specific. That's how these things usually happen. She found a folder misfiled under agricultural permits. Inside were photographs taken by a housing inspector who'd visited the Colt home just 2 weeks before the family vanished. The images were never attached to a formal report, just pictures, room after room, bare walls, no decorations, no family photos, no signs of life, except for one image taken in what appeared to be a basement. And in the photograph, there's a corner of the room where the floorboards are darker than the rest. Not stained, just worn. As if people had stood there for long periods of time, waiting. The inspector didn't document it, didn't explain it, but he took 3 separate photographs of that same corner, from slightly different angles, as if he sensed something there he couldn't articulate, as if part of him knew that corner mattered, and the most unsettling detail wasn't what was in the photograph, and it was what wasn't, and no toys, no books, no signs that children had ever lived there at all. And if this was a home, it had been emptied long before anyone officially left, and Alina didn't tell anyone at first. Archivists learn to sit with discomfort. They're trained to handle fragile things carefully, to not disturb the surface until they understand what they're looking at. But the Colt file didn't behave like a normal record. Every document inside it felt deliberately misaligned, as if someone had shuffled truth just enough to make it harder to see. And she began searching backward. Birth records, marriage licenses, employment histories. What she found was not scandal, not crime, not anything that would have triggered official concern. And that was the problem. The Colts were blank, not absent, just hollow. They existed on paper but left no emotional footprint in the community. No friendships, no disputes, no public memories that carried weight. People remembered them the way you remember furniture after it's been removed from a room. You notice the space it left, but you struggle to describe the object itself. And the deeper she looked, the more the timeline began to warp. And according to school enrollment, Daniel Colt should have been in 4th grade in 2003. According to health records, he hadn't seen a pediatrician since he was 6. According to church registries, he was baptized twice, once as a baby and again at age 9. No explanation was given for the second ceremony. That detail kept Alina awake for 3 nights. Repeated rituals rarely happen in healthy homes. They happen when something is being corrected or erased, and Margaret's records were stranger. Her grades were exceptional. Perfect attendance, high test scores, a model student. And yet every teacher who wrote about her used the same phrase in different ways. Difficultly distant, observant to an unsettling degree. One wrote that Margaret seemed to be cataloging everything around her, not learning, not engaging, recording, as if she believed someday she would need proof of something. And there was no official investigation into the family, no missing persons case, no report filed. That alone tells you how quietly this disappearance was accepted. Families don't simply vanish without triggering alarms, unless someone somewhere was quietly ensuring the alarms never rang. And Alina eventually tracked down the housing inspector who took the photographs. His name was Thomas Ivy, retired, living 2 counties over. She drove to his home with a folder of copies and a careful explanation rehearsed in her mind. She expected reluctance. What she didn't expect was relief, and he didn't ask why she was interested in the Colt house. He only said, "I wondered when someone would come." And he told her the inspection had been scheduled because of repeated anonymous complaints, not about noise, not about damage, but about activity. That was the word used, not disturbances, not concerns, just activity. People had reported seeing lights moving inside the house late at night, even after the family was supposedly asleep. Others claimed the children were sometimes visible in the windows during school hours, standing still, not playing, not watching television, just standing there as if positioned. And Thomas said he felt uneasy the moment he stepped inside, not because of what he saw, because of what he didn't. Homes tell stories, even neglected ones. A forgotten cup, a scuff on the wall, the subtle evidence of daily existence. The Colt house felt curated, like a stage between performances. Everything present only because it was necessary to pass inspection, nothing extra. Nothing human. And he admitted that he'd taken the basement photographs instinctively, that the corner in question made him feel as though he were being evaluated. Like I was standing in someone else's place, he said, like I had interrupted something that normally happened there. And he submitted his report. No violations, no grounds for further action. And then, 2 weeks later, the family vanished. And what Alina never included in her official notes was the final thing Thomas confessed. And he said that when he returned to his car after the inspection, he found something tucked beneath the windshield wiper. A folded piece of paper, no envelope, no name, just a single sentence written in careful, almost childlike handwriting, "And we are trying very hard to be good." And Alina never found that paper. Thomas said he burned it years ago, not out of fear, out of shame, because at the time, he dismissed it as nothing, a prank, a child's game, something that didn't deserve further thought. And that's the weight of this story. Not monstrous acts, not cinematic horror, but quiet moments where someone could have paused, could have asked one more question, could have chosen discomfort over convenience, and didn't. And Alina continued digging. She pulled property transfer records. The Colt house had changed ownership twice before the family moved in. Both previous owners had left abruptly as well, not vanished, but sold quickly, below market value. One of them had filed a formal complaint that was later sealed, not dismissed, sealed. That distinction matters, and she filed a request to unseal it. It took 6 months. Bureaucracy moves slowly when it's protecting something, and when the file finally arrived, it contained 1 page, and just one, and a statement from the former owner, written in neat, rigid handwriting. And this house teaches you how to disappear while still breathing. And Alina stared at that sentence longer than she cared to admit. Not because it sounded poetic, but because it sounded precise, as though someone had struggled to describe an experience that didn't fit language, and this was the closest they'd managed to get. A house that teaches you how to disappear while still breathing, not death, not violence. Something quieter, something that keeps the body present while the self erodes slowly, piece by piece, until what remains is compliant and hollow. And she began looking into the land itself, and before the Colt house, before the 2 previous families, the property had belonged to the state for nearly 40 years. Officially, it was categorized as unused woodland. Unofficially, it had once been home to something else. A facility that no longer appeared on modern zoning maps, a name that surfaced only in handwritten ledgers and forgotten microfilm reels. Briarwood Youth Behavioral Center, and the word center suggests help, structure, care. But when Alina found surviving inspection reports from the 1970s, the language was colder. Isolation practices, behavioral correction through repetition, identity suppression as treatment. These weren't criminal documents, they were clinical. Approved. signed off on by boards and agencies that no longer exist in their original forms. What happened at Briarwood wasn't hidden. It was simply normalized at the time, accepted, institutionalized, buried under professional language that made harm sound like medicine. And Briarwood specialized in non-compliant youth, children who were withdrawn, children who asked too many questions, children who resisted authority, children who didn't fit neatly into expectations. The treatment model was based on the idea that individuality itself was the problem, that personality could be reshaped through routine, silence, and controlled environments. The goal was not healing. It was obedience, and one document described the desired outcome as emotional neutrality, and not happiness, not safety, neutrality. And the center closed in 1981 following budget cuts, not outrage. The land was sold, the building demolished. A private contractor purchased the lot and built a modest home on the foundation that remained. No mention of the history was required. No disclosure laws applied to former institutions. The past was legally irrelevant, and but places remember. And Alina cross-referenced old blueprints with the housing inspector's photographs. The basement of the Colt house aligned almost perfectly with what had once been designated as Room 12. The reports described Room 12 as a reinforcement space, a place where children were brought to reset, a place with no windows, no stimuli, no interaction, where they were instructed to stand in a specific spot and remain still until compliance returned. And the worn corner in the photograph wasn't random, and it was a position, and a place where countless children had stood before, and waiting to be acceptable, and waiting to be corrected, and waiting to disappear enough to be allowed back into the world. And the idea that a building could carry that kind of memory sounds irrational until you read the testimonies. Former residents, now elderly, had left traces across obscure forums and archived interviews. Their words were fragmented, careful. Many refused to name the place directly, but they described the same experiences, the same white walls, the same emphasis on silence, the same lesson taught repeatedly that the safest way to survive was to erase yourself before someone else did it for you. And they learned how to be invisible without leaving, and they learned how to exist without taking up space, and they learned how to behave so perfectly that no one would ever look too closely again. And that kind of learning doesn't vanish when the building is gone. It embeds. It lingers in soil, in foundations, in the subtle atmosphere of a place. People who move into environments like that often report changes they can't explain. A growing urge to be quiet, a feeling of being observed even when alone, a strange comfort in routines that reduce them. None of it dramatic enough to report, all of it strong enough to shape behavior. And the Colt family didn't invent whatever happened inside that house, and they inherited it. And Alina started mapping timelines. The previous owner before the Colts had lived there for only 9 months. After moving out, she'd relocated to Arizona and changed her name. The owner before her had sold the house after a year and a half, citing unlivable atmosphere. That phrase appeared in his paperwork. Not unsafe, not damaged, just unlivable. As though something intangible had made daily life impossible. And the Colt family stayed for 11 years. And that was the difference. And they didn't leave. And they adapted. And that's where the story begins to shift from environment to choice. Because the records began to suggest something else. Something quieter, something more deliberate. The Colt parents, Aaron and Lillian, had backgrounds in behavioral psychology, not clinical practice, academic study. They'd written papers on environmental conditioning, on the impact of isolation, on how children internalize expectation when it's enforced consistently enough. And they didn't move into that house by accident. And they chose it. And once Alina saw that connection, once she understood that the atmosphere of the house might not have been harming the family, but aligning with their beliefs, the entire narrative darkened. This wasn't a haunting. This wasn't a curse. This was a philosophy lived out behind closed doors, shaped by a place that had been designed decades earlier to strip children down into something quieter and more manageable and more obedient and more empty. And the Colt children hadn't been victims of a bad house, and they'd been subjects in an ongoing experiment. And Alina struggled with what came next. There's a difference between uncovering history and realizing you're standing inside someone else's intention. The documents didn't just imply neglect or ideology. They suggested design, planning, a long-term shaping of human lives inside a space already saturated with decades of enforced silence. And the Colt parents' academic history painted a clearer picture the longer she studied it. Aaron Colt's graduate thesis explored the concept of behavioral erosion, a theory that personality could be softened over time through environmental repetition alone, not through force, not through punishment, but through controlled surroundings that trained the mind to self-correct. He argued that children placed in emotionally neutral environments would eventually stop expressing extremes altogether. They wouldn't rebel, they wouldn't demand, they wouldn't resist. They would learn to regulate themselves into quiet compliance. And Lillian Colt's work focused on something even more unsettling. She wrote about what she called inherited restraint, the idea that children raised in an atmosphere of chronic silence would pass that silence forward. That suppression could become generational, embedded in behavior so deeply it would feel like personality rather than conditioning. Her writing was polished, academic, cold. She never used the word control. She used the word harmony, and together, their published work was praised for its intellectual rigor. Neither of them ever referenced Briarwood. Neither acknowledged the origin of many of the practices they seemed to be adapting. But the parallels were unmistakable. Stand here. Stay still. Do not react. Do not interrupt. Reduce yourself until you are easier to manage, easier to predict, easier to shape. And Alina found no evidence of physical harm, no emergency room visits, no police reports, no medical flags. That's what made the case so difficult to classify. Whatever happened in that house had been quiet enough to avoid systems designed to catch danger. That didn't make it less damaging. In some ways, it made it worse. Trauma that leaves no visible mark is the easiest kind to ignore. And the children's journals, however, told a different story, and she didn't find them in any official archive. She found them through a community message board dedicated to abandoned properties. Someone had posted photographs years earlier of items they claimed to have taken from the Colt house before it was boarded up. Among them were 3 notebooks. The handwriting inside matched school samples from Margaret and Daniel. The posts had gained little attention at the time. Most people assumed it was fiction, creative writing, a hoax, and it wasn't. And Margaret's entries were meticulous dates, observations, measurements of time. She described daily routines in careful detail. Wake up at 6:00, breakfast in silence, standing time in the basement, reading time, no television, no music, no unstructured conversation. Everything recorded like data. Like she believed someone someday might need a record of what life inside that house actually felt like. And Daniel's journal was harder to read. Not because of handwriting, because of what he didn't say. His entries were brief, sparse, often repeating the same phrases. Did well today, was quiet today, did not think too loudly. One entry read, they say the house listens better when we listen to the house. He never explained what that meant. He never needed to. The meaning sits heavy without clarification, and the youngest child, Elise, had a notebook too. Only a few pages had been photographed before the thread ended. Her entries were drawings, mostly shapes. Mostly small figures standing in corners, always alone, always facing the wall. And Alina reached out to the person who'd posted the images. The account was inactive. The email bounced. Another dead end. Another voice lost to time. Another piece of testimony left floating in the margins where no authority was required to acknowledge it. And what haunted Alina most wasn't the idea of cruelty. It was the idea of intention wrapped in patience. The Colt parents didn't appear to be acting out of rage. They weren't chaotic. They weren't volatile. They were consistent, methodical, calm. They believed they were doing something meaningful, something corrective, something that would produce better humans by slowly stripping away everything unpredictable about them. And then the house had helped, and it reinforced their worldview. It rewarded quiet. It normalized the idea that presence without expression was ideal, that standing still for long periods was normal, that speaking only when necessary was virtuous. The environment didn't create their ideology, but it amplified it, strengthened it, made it feel validated by something older than them. And Alina began to understand the final phase of the Colt timeline differently, and the disappearance didn't look like an escape. It didn't look like a breakdown. It looked like an endpoint, and after 11 years, the children had aged out of childhood. Margaret was nearly 18, Daniel approaching 15, Elise almost 12. The experiment, if that's what it had been, was nearing its conclusion. Whatever the Colts had been trying to create inside that house had either succeeded or failed. And there were no further school records after spring of 2004, no college applications, no driver's permit filings, no social security activity, no employment history. It wasn't that the children had died, and it was that they had ceased to exist in any visible way. And Alina began to suspect that might have been the intended outcome all along. And Alina reached the point where the records stopped being informative and started feeling complicit. Everything she uncovered existed because someone, somewhere, had chosen to write it down, to file it, to store it. And everything that was missing existed because someone had chosen not to. The silence around the Colt family wasn't an accident. It was architecture. A system that allowed people to vanish without ever triggering the word emergency. And she began asking a harder question, not what happened to them, but whether the disappearance was ever meant to be discovered at all. And because certain things were left behind too deliberately. And when the county eventually reclaimed the Colt property for unpaid taxes, a walkthrough was conducted before the house was scheduled for demolition. That inspection produced a final set of photographs. Alina obtained them through a public records request that took nearly a year. The images showed a house that was no longer staged, no longer curated. Whatever performance had once existed inside those walls had ended, and there were no personal belongings in the bedrooms, no clothing, no photographs, no traces of individual identity. But in the basement, room 12 space, something remained. Not an object, a pattern, and faint markings along the wall where tape had once been, not decorations. Measurements, heights, growth tracked over time, small increments, carefully updated, as though someone had been watching bodies develop in that space, as though someone had been measuring progress toward something. And near the floor, carved so lightly it would have been missed if the light didn't hit it at the right angle, were 3 sets of initials, MCDCEC, no dates, no commentary, just names reduced to letters, identity compressed into symbols. That felt intentional too, as if even in private, the children had learned to minimize themselves. And Alina tried to find them as adults. She ran their names through every database she had access to. Marriage records, employment histories, credit activity, death registries. There was nothing, not even alternate spellings, not even near matches. It was as though the identities themselves had been successfully erased from the public system, and that kind of disappearance is rare. It requires either extreme isolation or deliberate restructuring. People don't simply slip out of every network unless they are taught how. And the idea settled slowly, uncomfortably. Perhaps the experiment had worked, and not in the way the parents intended. Not in some clean academic outcome, but in a darker way. The children may have learned to become so self-contained, so untraceable, so quiet in their impact that they move through the world without ever registering. No social media, no paperwork, no footprint. Living lives so minimized they appeared like absences rather than presences, and that thought disturbed Alina more than any theory of violence ever could, because it suggested the possibility that this wasn't a tragedy that ended in 2004. It suggested this was a story still unfolding invisibly, and she took a week away from the archive, drove instead, visited the property in person, and the house had been torn down by then. Only the foundation remained, a rectangle of concrete sinking slowly into soil that had begun to reclaim it. Trees had grown back around the perimeter. The air felt heavy but not dramatic. No sudden chills, no cinematic dread, just a kind of emotional compression, like standing in a place that asked you, wordlessly, to lower your voice. And she stood where the basement would have been, where room 12 once existed. There was no marker, no plaque, no indication that anything had ever happened there. That absence felt deliberate too, not because someone had arranged it, but because this country has a habit of letting uncomfortable places dissolve quietly back into the landscape. And that's when Alina realized the most unsettling part of the story, and nothing about the Colt family required a conspiracy. No coordinated cover-up, no hidden organization. The system worked exactly as designed. The family fit neatly between the cracks. Too functional for intervention, too quiet for suspicion, too ordinary for scrutiny. And so, no one stopped them, no one questioned them. No one insisted on looking closer. And if you're still listening at this point, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have tried to expose it, escape it, protect it, or pretend it never existed at all? And because that's the real question buried beneath this story, not what the Colts did, but what any of us would do if we realized the harm in our own lineage was subtle enough to be justified, rationalized, even praised. If the damage wasn't loud, but disciplined, not chaotic, but controlled. And Alina never published her findings formally, not because she was afraid, but because she understood something she hadn't at the beginning. Stories like this don't disappear because they're hidden. They disappear because people don't know where to place them. There's no crime to prosecute, no villain to arrest, just an accumulation of choices made in private, reinforced by a place that had been engineered decades earlier to make those choices feel normal. And she archived everything, uploaded what she could, left digital traces in places other researchers might someday find. And then she stopped, and not out of closure, and out of respect for the fact that some stories don't end with answers. They end with a quiet understanding that certain systems once built continue operating long after the buildings are gone, that some families are shaped not by what is done to them, but by what is never challenged, and that some children grow up not to escape their upbringing, but to perfect it into something so subtle the world never notices them at all. And the Colt house is gone, but the methodology it embodied still exists in many forms. In homes where silence is valued over expression, in environments where obedience is rewarded more than authenticity, in families where children learn early that being unseen is safer than being known. And those places don't make the news, and they don't leave police reports, and they don't produce statistics. And they just quietly teach people how to disappear while still breathing. And there was one final thread Elena never shared publicly, not because it was too fragile, but because it was too easy to misinterpret. It didn't fit cleanly into records or timelines. It lived in the space between data points, where intuition begins to matter as much as documentation. And 6 months after she archived everything, she received an email from an unfamiliar address. No subject line, no greeting, just a single paragraph. And you don't know me, but I know what you've been looking for. Some of us were taught very young how not to be seen. That doesn't mean we were taught how to stop seeing. And no signature, no location data she could trace. The server bounced through 6 countries. A message designed to be read, not followed, and most people would have dismissed it as someone playing along with the story. Internet folklore. Someone trying to feel important by attaching themselves to a mystery. Elena almost did the same, but the phrasing caught in her chest. Some of us, not I, not me, us. And the email arrived 3 days after she'd quietly uploaded a final batch of Colt-related materials to an obscure digital archive. A site so niche it rarely appeared in search results. A place only other historians and archivists typically knew to check, which meant whoever had written to her hadn't stumbled across her work accidentally. They had been looking for it, and she didn't reply, and not because she wasn't curious, but because her entire career had taught her that when someone chooses to speak indirectly, it's often because direct contact carries risk, for them, for you, for both. Instead, she waited. She watched the archive's analytics, not obsessively, just enough to notice patterns. And over the next several weeks, the Colt files were accessed sporadically, always briefly, always from different regions, never long enough to suggest casual browsing. It looked more like someone checking something, verifying details, confirming whether specific pieces of information had been made public. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the activity stopped, and that might have been the end of it. And but a month later, Elena noticed something else, and new accounts had begun contributing to the same obscure forums where the journals had once been posted. Not discussing the Colts directly, not referencing the house, but telling stories that felt adjacent, carefully vague narratives about childhoods governed by silence, about families who believed emotional restraint was virtue, about being taught to minimize presence to avoid leaving traces, to treat identity as something dangerous to display. And these weren't horror stories. They weren't dramatic, they were restrained, almost clinical, and that consistency made them more unsettling than any sensational confession could have. And one post read, "We were taught that being observed was a privilege you had to earn, not a default state." Another said, "My parents didn't hurt us, they refined us." Someone else wrote, "I don't know how to explain that I was raised to be excellent at not existing." And none of the usernames repeated. None of the writing styles matched closely enough to suggest one person behind all of them. But the emotional architecture was the same. The language felt shaped by a similar internal rulebook, and Elena never responded to those posts either. She only read, quietly, respectfully, because she began to understand something that had eluded her for most of the investigation. And the Colt family story wasn't singular, and it was just the one she had found documentation for. And the real horror wasn't an isolated household on forgotten land. It was the realization that there are ideologies so subtle they don't look like abuse. They look like discipline. They look like values. They look like good upbringing. They hide in phrases people praise. Be quiet, be polite, don't draw attention, don't make waves. Don't embarrass the family, don't overshare, don't feel so much, don't be so much. And taken individually, those messages seem harmless. And taken together, repeated daily, embedded from childhood, they can hollow a person out just as effectively as any locked room ever could. And the house amplified what the Colts believed. But the belief itself didn't require that house to survive, and it only required a culture that rewards silence over honesty, and a community that equates obedience with virtue, and a system that struggles to recognize harm when it arrives dressed as structure. And that's why the Colt children don't appear in records, not necessarily because they vanished physically, but because they may have grown into adults who perfected the art of moving through the world without leaving impressions. No online presence, no conflict, no traceable relationships. People who understand how to function in society while remaining fundamentally unseen. And you pass people like that every day. And men who speak just enough to avoid suspicion. And neighbors who keep their lawns trimmed and their voices low. And coworkers who never talk about their personal lives. And people who learned early that safety comes from invisibility and carried that lesson forward into every space they entered. And the most unsettling possibility isn't that the Colt children were destroyed by their upbringing. And it's that they may have survived it exactly as they were trained to, and quietly, and effectively, and untraceably. And Elena still works in archives, still digitizes records, still preserves histories that would otherwise be forgotten. But she no longer believes that truth is always something you uncover in documents. Sometimes it's something you feel in patterns, in repeated absences, in the shape of what isn't there, and she keeps the Colt files accessible, not highlighted, not promoted, just present waiting, because she knows that somewhere, someone who understands these patterns from the inside might eventually find them, might recognize themselves in the margins, might see proof that what they experienced wasn't normal, wasn't isolated, wasn't just in their head, and that kind of recognition can be destabilizing, but it can also be the first step toward reclaiming something that was taken quietly long ago, an identity and voice, and presence, and the things the Colt house was designed to erase, and maybe that's the only real ending this story can offer. Not closure, not justice, just the understanding that the past doesn't always haunt us with loud events. Sometimes it whispers through behaviors we've normalized, through silences we've justified, through traditions we've inherited without question. And the Colt household didn't leave behind a crime scene, and it left behind a blueprint. And the most uncomfortable truth of all is that pieces of that blueprint still exist all around us, hidden inside ordinary homes, ordinary expectations, ordinary ideas of what it means to be well-behaved. And years have passed since Alina first opened the Colt file, and the world has not changed in any dramatic way because of it. There were no exposes, no viral outrage, no reckoning. And that, in a strange way, is the most honest ending this story could have. The truth about the Colt household didn't arrive like a storm. It arrived like dust, slowly, quietly, settling into the corners where only those who know how to look would ever notice it. And the foundation of the house is gone now. The county finished reclaiming the land, planted saplings, labeled the area as part of a minor conservation project. Families hike there on weekends. Children run through the trees without knowing what stood beneath their feet. The soil looks healthy. The air feels ordinary. No one senses the history unless they've been trained, like Alina, to feel the emotional residue of places that were once shaped around control. And that's how most real histories survive. Not as curses, not as ghosts, but as subtle patterns we fail to interrogate. And because the truth Alina uncovered was never really about the Colt family. They were just one instance where the architecture of silence, discipline, and ideological certainty aligned too perfectly. One example where old institutional harm echoed forward into private life. One case where the absence of oversight created a vacuum large enough for a family to reshape their children according to a theory rather than a conscience. But that structure exists everywhere, and not in the same form, not in the same intensity, but in the everyday ways children are taught to suppress discomfort for the sake of peace, in the way emotional restraint is praised while emotional honesty is labeled as weakness, in the way boys especially are often taught that their value lies in control, containment, composure. Don't cry, don't complain. Don't talk about what happens at home. Don't admit confusion. Don't admit hurt. Be strong. Be quiet. Be manageable. And those messages don't sound dangerous when they're said softly enough, and they don't trigger investigations. They don't show up in court documents. They don't produce visible bruises. But over time, they can produce something else. Adults who struggle to identify their own emotions, men who feel disconnected from their own identities, people who move through life feeling unseen, even when surrounded by others. People who learned so early how to minimize themselves that they never learned how to fully exist. And that's why the Colt story resonates when people encounter it, not because of sensational horror, but because of recognition. And the idea of being taught to disappear while still breathing doesn't feel foreign to many people. It feels familiar in ways they've never quite articulated, like an unspoken rule they learned in childhood and carried forward without questioning where it came from. And Alina still receives messages occasionally, not as direct as the first one, not as explicit, but they arrive in the same tone, carefully worded. Anonymous. People thanking her for preserving the files. People saying they finally understood something about their own upbringing. People saying they'd never spoken about their childhood before reading those documents, but that seeing the patterns written down made it impossible to keep dismissing their own experience as normal. And she never responds to those messages either, and not because she doesn't care, but because she knows that her role was never to become a guide. It was to become a witness, to make sure the record existed, to make sure silence wasn't total, to leave behind a trail of evidence for those who needed proof that what they felt had a history. And the Colt household is not a legend. It's not a myth. It's not a horror story meant to entertain. It's something more uncomfortable than that. It's a mirror held up to a culture that often values obedience over authenticity, control over connection, appearance over well-being. A reminder that harm doesn't always look violent. Sometimes it looks organized, polite, respectable. And perhaps the most unsettling truth of all is this: nothing about this story required monsters. No villains twirling in darkness, no dramatic evil, just ordinary people with convictions left unchallenged, systems that failed to question them, and a society that often prefers quiet compliance to difficult conversations. And that's how these stories persist, and not because they are hidden, but because they are recognizable, and we are taught to look away from what feels too close to home. And somewhere there are people who grew up like the Colt children. Not identical experiences, but similar emotional architecture. People who learn to shrink, to observe, to survive by staying small. Some of them may still be living that way now. Some of them may be listening to this story and recognizing pieces of themselves in it. Some of them may be realizing for the first time that what they experienced had a shape, a pattern, a history. And if this story leaves you with discomfort, that's not an accident. It's not meant to terrify. It's meant to linger, to sit quietly in the back of your mind when you hear certain phrases, when you see certain behaviors, when you notice the way silence is often praised without question. And because the real archive of this story isn't in county records or sealed documents, and it's in people, and in the behaviors passed down, and in the lessons normalized, and in the quiet spaces where identity either grows or is slowly taught to disappear. And the Colt house is gone, but the choice to notice what it represented is still here. And what you do with that awareness, that part of the story no one else can write for you.